My first steps into the crooked cemetery, I looked around and I confirmed that I was alone. Unlike the other attractions, I was all by myself. It made sense. It was a lot of work to get here, and unlike the fairgrounds or the ranch, there wasn't much to do except be scared. And I was another step closer to the center of the labyrinth. I finally remembered what my sister told me was the final prize at the center of the pumpkin house. Some kind of curio called the Myself Mirror, a powerful augury tool that gave the viewer the power to view themselves in the future. Not simply one future, but all possible futures, and would help guide them on the path to be that person. She told me that one year she made it all the way to the Myself Mirror when she saw how gorgeous, brave, and independent she was in the future, when at the time she was so timid and lost. It gave her the strength she needed to come out and transition. Even though she was much happier now, when I asked her about what she saw, she only told me she wasn't done becoming what she saw in the mirror. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I remember hearing that story and wishing I could see the myself mirror, so that I would know what kind of person I would grow up to be. So far, the only thing I wanted to be when I grew up was happy and alive, even though both of these things felt like they were in doubt. I figured if anything had the answer, it was going to be the myself mirror. All I had to do was make it through the crooked cemetery and then the maestro's mausoleum. I did enjoy the fog. It was atmospheric and calming, and the only thing I had to worry about was the distant lights in the form of death candles. I figured that was the best place to start as I made my way past the beach into the first line of gravestones. I stuck to the path, but I couldn't help but look at the stones. It was just like the backstory my sister told. Most of the graves were only given the name infant and a single date. I walked past them and I couldn't help but feel my heart break. So many deaths before the advent of modern medicine. Dead upon birth or just after. I was reminded that not even 200 years ago, infants weren't given a name until their first birthday. The mortality rate was so high that it was considered impractical to name every infant if they weren't going to make it. And of course, that death rate also affected the mothers. Infection and even the childbirth itself were dangerous and often deadly to their mothers. Poor hygiene and lack of birth control usually meant high mortality for those who got pregnant. At some points, it was more dangerous than going to war. But with the discovery of modern germ theory, hygiene, and eventually birth control, humanity thrived and the population exploded. And now it was commonplace for infants to be named before they were even born. Still, this was more haunting than the werewolves and the cenotaphs. To understand how much death was in the past and how much of them would never even have a chance for a future. Still, something wasn't right. I read the tombstones again and it was familiar. Infant, September 5th, 2400 AUC. Wasn't that the same date I saw when I first came here? That was odd, but certainly not unlikely or even common. The birthday paradox came to mind. If you had just a group of 23 people, then the odds of two of them sharing the same birthday was over 50%. I passed by over 400 graves. So the odds of two of them sharing a birthday was greater than 100%. I rethought my problem, recalling the dates I saw, the dates in front of me, and this was the first one that matched an earlier birthday. Everything else had a completely different date, without a single repetition in month, day, and year. That didn't make any sense from a statistical point of view. Even in a perfectly spread out random chart clusters and repetitions occurred. There's only 365 days in a typical year and 366 in a leap year. Especially in a sample size this large, 400 was more than how many days were in a leap year. Even if I had a sample size of 20 graves, if they were truly random, there was practically only a coin flip that at least two would match. With this many, the only way that there were no repetitions was if an outside force was interfering with the true randomness. There was nothing special about the gravestone, but I still kept it in mind as I continued my trek forward. My compass pointing down the path, I continued my walk. Every 5 gravestones had a burning candle on it, and still there were no repetitions in a single date. I was approaching 800 different graves, and every single one had a different birthday from every other grave. If I passed by 2,000 graves, was I going to start seeing negative years? There were only so many different dates before a repetition occurred, no matter what force was interrupting my efforts. After the 800th grave, I ran across the repetition again. Infant, September 5th, 2400 AUC. The stone was identical to every stone around it. On a hunch, I marked an X on the path in front of the gravestone and followed the way my compass was pointing. Sure enough, I followed the trail. There were no other repetitions, and I wasn't getting hungry nor tired. But I still started sucking on a gummy isopod, figuring out I was going to do to escape from this liminal labyrinth. I continued trekking, and I saw the X in front of the gravestone before I saw the gravestone itself. Infant, September 5th, 2400 AUC. So it was truly repeating, but none of the other gravestones were repeating. So if this wasn't working, I would have to try to find a brand new method, even if it contradicted what my compass was saying I should do. I stepped on the grave and made it to the trail behind it. It was more of the same, never-ending sequences of non-repeating dates, except for a single one. September 5th, 2400 AUC, and the X I marked in front of it, which remained in front of the gravestone. So, if the stone in this part of the path was moving, no matter what row I walked, then it must be something important. The only repetition in the entire sequence was this number. And if this was the only repetition, then the rest of the pattern was a non-repeating sequence. Like the digits of pi, it was never ending and never repeating. So then, even if my compass was not working, I would have to figure out the puzzle of the gravestone. I started simply, and I pressed the gravestone, figuring there must be a button or a hidden panel to press. But nothing, even when I pressed all over it. I tried tracing the date, and sure enough, no luck. So I tried thinking about the date to see if anything important occurred on that date. While I knew quite a bit of history, there was nothing associated with September 5th as far as I knew, unless the puzzle had something to do with International Cheese Day. The year wasn't any help either. While I was certain the year 2400 was important to someone historically, I couldn't think of anything that occurred. The age of exploration was occurring, colonies were being built in Vespucci and Sealy, wars for independence wouldn't occur for another 150 years, the colonies weren't ended yet, no great wars occurred that year, no kings were crowned, no kings died. It was an unremarkable year surrounded by remarkable years. That seemed to be on the track for something, so I thought about it for a moment more. An unremarkable thing among remarkable things. The non-repeating dates and the ever-changing stones. What was important about their dates? I checked the stone to the left of the stone I was sitting at. March 15th, 709 AUC. Nearly everyone knew that date. The date Julius Caesar was assassinated, setting off a long line of dictators that still ruled over the modern Roman Republic. I checked the stone to my right. June 28th, 2667. The start of the Great War. Another date I was familiar with, a date that is extremely important, and instead I was paying attention to an unimportant date simply because it repeated a lot. But then again, if I didn't notice the repetition, I probably would have continued following the path, not finding a way out. So, on a hunch, I inspected the stone with Caesar's assassination. Just underneath the date, I found a small crack, with just enough space for the key. I checked my compass again, and it still pointed down the path. So, instead, I inserted the key and twisted it. I heard a crack of sorts, and not sure what happened, I pulled back my key and I looked down the path. This time it ended in another path, which led to a different part of the crooked cemetery. A crossroads, of sorts, for myself. One I could have entered at any point if I used my key. How many people were trapped in the liminal space because they didn't try to save Richard? I tried not to dwell on that thought while I followed the trail, which led to an iron fence. Just beyond it, I could see the pumpkin house. It stood 2 stories tall and had a jack-o'-lantern in front of the steps. And that unsettled me more than the Rancid Ranch or the docks. Everything else I faced so far went out of their way to show how scary they were. But the pumpkin house looked like anywhere else in Autumn County. Unassuming and safe. And that terrified me more than anything. The pumpkin house didn't need to show itself as scary. It was the apex of everything else, and it didn't need to show off strength. It knew it was strong, and it didn't need to try to scare people away by acting strong. I followed the fence for a while to try and find a way past. But the fence was over 10 meters tall with sharp spearheads on top. It was clear it wasn't meant to be climbed over. So the only way past the iron fence was going to be the mausoleum. If I could find it. I checked my compass and sure enough it pointed to the west. So I followed the path next to the iron fence. The cemetery was silent and I stayed silent too. This didn't feel like it was a place where you could speak. I didn't want to attract the attention of anything that was hiding out in the cemetery. One of the graves I passed looked unusual compared to the others. It had an iron cage built over it, a deterrent to resurrection men, or grave robbers if you prefer. Some legends said it was to keep the bodies from rising from the dead. However, they were actually constructed to keep the bodies in the ground from being stolen by the living. So it made sense some of these were built to keep the bodies safe from the jackals. I passed the iron cage and I heard a weak scrabbling inside of the cage. I glanced inside of it and felt my breath catch when I saw what was staring back at me. The blank, maggot-filled sockets stared back into my eyes, and the yellowed skeleton still had bits of rotten flesh sticking to its bones as it reached out its weak hand through the bars and towards my face. At first, it looked like it was trying to reach out for help, but then I read the headstone. Here lies the face peeler, executed December 12th, 2598 AUC. I read, and I backed away from the skeleton, still reaching for my face. It would be best to keep away from the murderous skeleton. So, instead, I continued down the trail, remaining quiet and made sure to stay calm. Whatever I faced now would be temporary, and the prize of the myself mirror was forever. I had to remember that. I passed a series of graves that all had bells inside of them. The gravestones were built to resemble small churches, and the bell inside of the tower. Constructed during an era when getting buried alive was a legitimate concern. So people sold many solutions, such as bells or being buried with food and drink. The problem with these solutions? Most of them didn't bother to include air holes for the entombed, so if you were buried alive, you didn't have very long until you were buried dead. I stayed on the path, but still, as I passed each grave, the bell above them started to ring, one by one. Soon it was a chorus of tintillations, but when I passed the last grave, the ringing suddenly stopped. Whatever was down in those graves was still able to ring bells, and they wanted me to investigate the graves. So I was going to ignore that. It wasn't too far down the path when I saw the jackal. He looked like a normal person at first, but then when I got closer, I saw that he wasn't quite normal. His arms were too long, his fingers were more claw-like than finger-like. His hair grew down to his waist and was surprisingly well cared for. His mouth had teeth that were too long to be held in his mouth, and his eyes were all black and focused on the grave he was digging up. His mouth had teeth that were too long to be held with his lips, and his eyes were all black and focused on the grave he was digging up. But once I saw the jackal, he saw me too. He stood up and tilted his head, figuring out what I was. When his eyes widened and he licked his lips, I knew it was time to run. I quickly turned the way I came and ran as he ran after me, running with his hands and feet. He was quicker than the werewolf, so I knew I had to lose him quickly. But he didn't seem to be the kind to let prey go. But thankfully, I had an idea. When I made it to the row with the bells, I peeked behind me and confirmed that the jackal was still chasing me, and he was only a few meters behind me. So, taking my final chance, I leapt to the row behind the gravestones with a running jump. I had to be careful not to touch the gopher dust that laid over these graves. I just barely made it to the new trail, and the jackal, not thinking about what was happening, he just ran over the graves with the bells. The jackal's feet and hands sank into the soft soil, and when he could no longer step, he let out a loud howl, one that echoed across the entire cemetery. The jackal continued to sink as his hungry eyes met my own. Even as what was underneath the dirt pulled the jackal underneath, the jackal knew no fear, no confusion, just hunger. And he still saw me as food, even as the grave pulled him underneath. When the jackal was pulled down under, I let myself take a breath again as I checked my compass. It still pointed west. So I continued my trail, and when I made it to the grave the jackal excavated, something else now stood there. It looked like a bored man, simply filling the dirt the jackal removed. It had only been a few minutes, and already the grave was nearly filled up. The grave digger didn't respond to me, so instead I continued my trek, trying not to think about the grave digger turning to face me. I finally made it to the front of the mausoleum. It was an imposing stone edifice that stood tall. The steps leading up to the door looked normal, but just before the door were a dozen candles, 6 on the left and 6 on the right, and a single skeletal figure, yellow and cracked with age, who was struggling to light the candles. There was a lantern in front of the closed door that the skeleton used to light a single lighting stick, and then would bring the stick slowly to the candles. But by the time the old skeleton made it to the candle, the sticks were extinguished. So he would return to the lantern to light the stick again and start the process all over again. Clearly, the skeleton was not going to make progress. I grabbed one of the lighting sticks next to the lantern, and then I started lighting the candles. I had a much easier time than the old skeleton who watched me light all dozen candles and extinguish the lighting stick. The skeleton stared at me and then pushed the door to the mausoleum open. "Thank you," I signed to him as I made my way into the maestro's mausoleum. The foyer had a large painting of a stern-looking pale man with a dark cape, a bushy mustache, and red eyes that seemed to follow me. This must be the Count De Ville. The door slammed shut behind me, and I could hear the loud click of the door locking me inside. Now it was time for me to solve Maestro Maximus's mausoleum maze. The foyer had only one other door, and I could already hear the sound of buzzing electricity, and I could smell the tang of vinegar. I checked my compass, and sure enough, it pointed out that the door was the fastest, and likely the only, way to the pumpkin house. I slowly opened the door and peered through in the first room. On the far side, I could see the other door, and I could also see what was in the room. The cage hung from the ceiling like a chandelier. The figure inside of the cage smelled heavily of vinegar. Clearly a preservative agent used by the maestro to preserve the revenant from rot. The figure didn't move while hanging in the cage, but I knew in my heart that it was dangerous. And the cages along the walls didn't reassure me either. They were all cast iron, but within each one was other pickled bodies. All of them still and with chunks of their bodies missing, clearly cut away by a sharp carving knife. Were these bodies going out, or was he collecting them? I wasn't sure, but I was certain I couldn't stay here. I walked across the room and the ghouls stayed still, but I did notice that their eyes followed me, but they didn't try to get me. At least, not yet. Once I made it to the other door, I closed it behind me and let out a sigh of relief when I saw it was just a normal hallway. A few tables with tablecloths on the sides, and paintings of the moon on the walls. Quite a few, actually. I counted 8 different paintings of the moon, each of them reflecting a different color of light. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, white, and black. These must be the moons of Astoria, I thought to myself, while I admired the many moons on the walls. They didn't resemble each other in topography, so it made sense for them to be different moons altogether. But as I was admiring the beauty of a moon radiating black light that shouldn't be possible, I heard the click of the door in front of me. Someone was trying to get it open, and they were headed my way. Quickly, wanting to avoid them, I dove for a nearby table and hid under the tablecloth. hoping it will be able to keep me safe from what is coming from the other side of the door. I sat hidden while the door finally opened and the maestro stepped into the hallway. He was hunched over, like I was expecting, like he was carrying a heavy weight. His cloak was dark and old, full of holes and scrapes, while he shuffled forward. He also carried an old shepherd's crook like a walking stick, and in the cold of the mausoleum, his breath was visible as he wheezed his way forward. But then I saw what was on his back. It was attached to his back with a golden thread. The body on his back was only chest, arms, and head. Attached back to back, the creature on his back had clearly been dead a long time. Maggots infested the corpse and flies buzzed around them both. I tried not to stare too long, but it looked like maggots were crawling from the corpse's body into the maestro's body, via the holes made by the stitches. The corpse stared up at the ceiling, moaning softly and his arms waving weakly. A literal burden given to the maestro, who now carried it everywhere he went. But despite the burden, the maestro continued his trek, and I waited for him to enter the room I just left. Once the door was closed, I quickly got up and headed to the next door. I didn't know how long I had, but I had to stay as far away from the body of death as I could. The next room was where it got confusing. There were 3 separate winding stairways that led up to the next floor. Checking my compass didn't help. The needle didn't point anywhere in particular. It just lazily drifted around the compass interior. One was marked with an omega and a golden plaque. The stairs next to it had an inverted omega, also in gold. The final stairs were marked with an infinity symbol with a cross on top of it. Clearly, this was a riddle I had to solve. Obviously, only one of them leads to the upstairs proper. The others either led to traps or quite possibly dumped me back out into the cemetery. So I had to figure out what these symbols meant. They looked familiar, so I thought about it for a moment before I realized what they reminded me of. Alchemical symbols, of course. The symbol on the far right was sulfur, but also widely interpreted to mean hell, so clearly I wasn't going anywhere near those stairs. The omega on the left meant death, or more specifically, the end of life. The symbol in the middle, the inverted omega, meant life. It was the only one that had a positive connotation, so I figured it was the proper way to the second floor. I took the stairs up to the second floor and found myself in a room with 4 doors. Another crossroads. I looked at all 4 doors and they all looked identical to me. And again, my compass still wasn't working. So I simply decided to choose the one on my right. Eventually, I would make my way out. The room to my right was full of instruments. But these weren't normal instruments. Every piece was carved out of bone, every string made out of sinew, and the parchment of the sheet music was clearly made from human skin. The ink on the page was brown when it was old, and red where it was fresh. Blood. And I could even see, from where I was, the name of the sheet music. On Mount Golgotha. When I saw that, I immediately cast my eyes to the ground and covered my ears before the instruments could start playing. Even I knew about the curse of that song. Anyone who read that composition would be compelled to complete it, using their own blood and body to write it, trying to complete the song that would never be complete and dying for the art. A fate I didn't want to share with all the poor fools who died to join the maestro's orchestra. Fortunately, I could see the exit door. My compass, thankfully, pointed towards it. I shuffled slowly until I heard a single chord of a cello thrum through the air. I glanced at where the instrument laid on the wall. There was no one playing it. It was playing itself, and if I was to guess, it was going to play on Mount Golgotha. I hurried just as the other instruments joined into the song. Well, calling it a song was giving it too much credit. It was cacophony. The pattern wasn't one I could recognize, but my heart couldn't help but try to match the confusing beat of the composition. I had to hurry, or else I was going to be killed by the song. I made it to the door and slammed it shut behind me, the noise cut off by the door. I gave my heart a few extra moments to calm down before I looked around the room I was in. This was a lab. Rows of colorful liquids lined the walls. The surgeon table had a body underneath a white sheet. The door on the far side had a clear lock on it. I figured all it would take was my key. I approached the door confident and inserted the key and twisted it. Except it didn't work. This key wasn't the right key. It had to be somewhere in this room, but where? There were no tables, no boxes. The liquids on the wall were glued directly to the wall. The only place it could be hidden was... I looked at the surgeon table in the middle of the room. It had to be under the sheet. Of course. The only way to move forward would be to steal it from a corpse. I approached the body slowly, expecting a jump scare or worse, but nothing happened. The body remained still, and when I grabbed the sheet, I took a deep breath. If I kept this sheet on, whatever was under here would be worse than it actually was. I would just remove the sheet and grab the key. I wouldn't have to look at the body any longer than I had to. Just find the key, grab it, and go. I lifted the sheet and saw the body underneath. It was cut open in a Y incision, and most of the organs and the rib cage were removed. No blood remained, and the inside reminded me more of beef jerky than anything else. And I did see the key, located in the chest cavity, within the cardiac cavity that once held the heart. So I wouldn't just be stealing a key from a corpse. I would be stealing it directly from the inside of a corpse. I held my breath while I steeled myself to reach into the body. I knew the risk was low of disease, and I wouldn't have to touch anything inside of the body. I can just carefully grab the key and be on my way. Clearly, the challenge here is similar to those peeled grape challenges. They tell you something like it's eyeballs, so the texture is off-putting. This isn't a real body. It was a latex mold, and it was all pataphysics. You create a challenge for the hero to face, so that way they can change more for the narrative. The narrative was telling me to reach into the corpse, and that was what I was going to do. Odds are, since it was challenging enough by itself, they wouldn't add anything else on top of it. Now feeling a bit better, I convinced myself it was just a latex mold as I reached into the chest cavity. I couldn't help but feel like my hand was colder inside of the cavity. Surely a trick of the mind, I told myself as I touched the cold silver key. Nothing happened, and I let out the breath I was holding. Nothing was going to happen. I grabbed the key and began to pull it out of the corpse when the body's hand swung around and grabbed my own arm. The corpse's eyes shot open and stared directly into my own eyes as its mouth opened like it was trying to speak. But it had no air for its words because it had no lungs in its breast. I screamed as I yanked my arm away from it. I ran to the locked door with the key and used it to open the door. But I couldn't remove the silver key, so I slammed it behind me again. The last thing I saw was the cadaver sitting up straight and smiling towards me. A hungry smile. I was glad the door locked behind me. The room in front of me was a long, dark hallway. I could see a steampunk-style chandelier above, and the only light source was the distant open door. I shuffled forward, holding my right hand to the white wall as I made my way forward. I kept my eyes on the light in front of me. I would keep myself focused on it and not worry about the darkness. This was a cool-down area, so I would just have to focus on bringing myself to the next room. I passed under the chandelier and when I heard it clatter against the ceiling. At that noise, I looked up at the chandelier. The glass and metal clanked and moved and changed shape when I saw what it was. It wasn't a chandelier, it was the augmenting arachnid. At that point, I decided to run. Thankfully, just in time as the automated abomination descended on a steel cable, landing where I just was. The 8 eyes were made of different magnifying glasses that all focused on me. The fangs were made of curved needles that led to very large syringes full of an unknown yellow fluid. The pedipalps in front of the fangs ended in surgical clamps and were jointed and jerked like a wooden puppet. The legs were long and moved much smoother than the pedipalps did. The tips of each ended in a different retractable tool. I could see scalpels, bone saws, and tweezers all retracted on its rusty legs. I ran towards the door, only for the armored arachnid to fire a steel hook at the end of a large steel cable. Thankfully, it just missed me. Only I realized I wasn't the target of the augmenting arachnid. The hook collided with the door as the spider pulled the door closed, leaving us both in total darkness. Now, in a moment of desperation, I quickly moved to the left wall and crawled up as small as I could. As I heard the mechanical spider collide where I was just a moment ago. Turns out the augmenting arachnid couldn't see in the dark any better than I could. But that was only so much of a comfort. The threat was still nearby, and it just had to be lucky enough to find me once. I had to keep staying lucky enough to avoid it. But thankfully, the spider wasn't all that smart as it continued down the hallway, heading to the door. It must have thought that I made my way to the door, but when it made it to the door, I heard only a few more clanks and then silence. It was guarding the door. Of course, it didn't need to know where I was. If I wanted to leave this hallway, that was the only way I could go. There had to be a way forward. I thought to myself as my hands came down to the ground, trying to feel if there was something nearby. I felt something round in my hand, maybe a ball bearing or a marble. It did give me an idea, though. I picked up the marble and threw it hard against the door on the far side of the hallway. It clanked against the door, and immediately I heard the augmenting arachnid clatter against the ceiling as it rushed towards the far door. I crawled forward quickly and quietly, making it to the door, Just as the mechanical spider collided with the distant door, I opened the door on my side and turned back just as the spider turned back to face me. Realizing that it was tricked, I shut the door again and turned to look at the new horrors in the room I was in. There was a single stairway that led up to the third floor. My compass verified it was the correct way. I traveled up the winding stairway and I made my way to the third floor. It led to a very large room full of chairs arranged like an orchestra. Every chair was empty and that didn't reassure me, but I did see an exit. But I also heard heavy, shuffling footsteps coming from the darkness. I quietly ducked underneath a chair while I waited for the shuffling footsteps to come into view. Severus Maximus came into view. He carried a baton in one hand like he was a conductor, and the being bound to his back carried a violin and bow with him. The maestro stood in the conductor's podium and faced the chairs. He tapped his baton to the podium and then began to swing the baton, leading a silent orchestra. It took a few moments before I recognized the movements. An experimental performance made back in 2705 AUC, called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. That was the name of the performance. During that performance, all musicians were instructed to not play their instruments at all. It was supposed to make the audience think about the sound of an orchestra without the music. So I did what I was supposed to, and I listened. I heard the creak of the timbers settling. I heard the swish of the conductor swinging his baton, and I heard the rasps of the revenant. These were meant to be unsettling, but all I felt was curiosity. What did the maestro do for fun for himself? I was told he was loyal to his master and he served without hesitation, but that was just his profession, not who he was as a person. And here I was observing him, where he thinks no one can see him, leading an empty orchestra in a silent symphony. That was hopeful. Someone who saw himself still leading, even when he had no one to lead. Maybe that was why he kept on Mount Golgotha, so he could finish the unfinishable piece and play the unplayable music. Here he was leading a symphony of silence, so clearly he had musical aspirations. Maybe he will succeed someday, if he ever stopped torturing the dead and dying with unholy science. After the third act of the performance, he put his baton down on the podium and bowed first to the empty orchestra and then to the dark audience. What I wasn't expecting was to hear an applause. The lights came on in the auditorium and I saw what was there in the seats. They weren't people, or at least they weren't people anymore. Some of the parts definitely used to be people, but what sat in all of those seats, filling every chair in the auditorium, was a partially animatronic skeleton. The skulls were human and the eyes were small red LEDs. They wore suits that covered their rib cages, and the spine connected to the chair via a steel rod. Their arms and hands were a mix of bone and steel, gears connected to joints, bones screwed into steel, and rubber covered the phalanges, metacarpals, and carpals to make hands that could clap. Now, the maestro's performance no longer looked hopeful. It now looked like a performance for his own ego and madness than anything else. Performing a silent piece was practice. Having an animatronic audience to cheer you on after you perform a silent symphony was just stroking his own ego. The sexton of the cemetery stepped off the podium back into the aisles. disappearing behind a door. After giving him a few minutes, I left my hiding place and I traveled down the aisle to where he left. I didn't look at the skeletons, but I knew it would have taken a lot of bodies to fill every seat in the auditorium. I tried the door he disappeared into. It was locked. My key didn't work on it either. Clearly, I had to try the exit I saw in the first place. So I searched the aisles and I saw a distant red door. This looked like it was the right place to go. I walked down the aisles, aware of all the skeletons, and as I passed them, I also became aware of their heads twisting to watch me. Even when it would have broken their necks, their heads were all turned to face me. I saw it and I decided not to react. They weren't doing anything but watching me, so I just made it to the red door and opened it before closing it behind me. I turned around and nearly threw up when I saw what room it was. It was the kitchen. The ceiling was high and there were long sides of meat dangling from the hooks. While I couldn't recognize the meat, it was too small for beef, and the ribs were too small to be a pig. Bowls sat on the counter and they were filled with what looked like extra long gray sausages. I didn't get close to it. I knew what made up sausage casings, and with the backstory of this place, I knew what these sausages were made of to look so pork-like. I quickly headed to the other door, which, thankfully, led to the dining room. The table was long, but there was only a single chair at the table, and I could see on the wall a ladder. And sure enough, it led both up into the attic, and I assume it would lead back to the fairgrounds. But the ladder below was where I wanted to go. It would lead to the pumpkin house and my final challenge, the smallest but scariest of the haunted houses, but at the center of it all would be the myself mirror and the unraveling of the entire mystery of the pumpkin house. But what made this one different from all the others was there was no one here to guide me or to warn me. I would make the choice freely and without fear. I climbed down the ladder and into the darkness below. The ladder led outside to where I was on the front lawn of the pumpkin house. It was 2 stories tall. The paint had faded, but it was not peeling. The lawn was well maintained, and the steps leading up to the door had a single jack-o'-lantern. It had no lead up, and all I could do was walk up to the door. Sure enough, the door opened itself and I stepped forward, bravely and mentally preparing myself for whatever was going to come through that door. Whatever was inside, I would face it, just to finally get to see who I was going to become. The door slammed shut behind me, leaving me in darkness, just as the candles along the walls lit up, revealing the interior of the pumpkin house.